1927, an obscure Chinese agitator wrote, "In a short time, several 100 million peasants will rise like a tornado, a force so extraordinary, swift, and violent that no power, however great, will be able to suppress it. They will send all imperialists, warlords, corrupt officials, local bullies, and evil gentry to their graves. All revolutionary parties and all revolutionary comrades will stand before them to be tested." The author of these words eventually found a way to harness the power of China's peasant millions to make himself the ruler of a quarter of the world's population. Mao Tse-tung. The Chinese have a word, luan. Luan means chaos, anarchy. Mao Tse-tung, absolute ruler of China's millions, believed in luan, but he saw it as a positive force, a force which paradoxically could be organized to produce order. The greater the chaos, the greater the order. In the Cultural Revolution, Mao Tse-tung plunged his country into chaos, assuming that out of it would come the greatest order which China had ever seen. The face of old China. According to Mao, his father had once been a poor peasant who, by hard work and good business sense, rose to be a rich peasant. Rich enough, at least, to give Mao a start in life. In 1893, when Mao was born, China was still ruled by the Manchu dynasty. 8,000 years of civilization lay heavily on China's back and seemed to have drained all the strength out of her. She was a museum piece among the powers of the world, a dinosaur that had somehow survived into the wrong age.
Mao was born into a China which was in chaos. It was a country in which the empire was dying, and it had lost its power and had been losing its power for about 100 years. There were the great imperial powers, the European powers, and the Japanese, who were forever moving into China, taking over this area or that area and imposing their will, so that China almost, at the time Mao was growing up, was a figment of the imagination or an idea rather than a real country.
The struggle for power in China began with a nationalist revolution against the old regime led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Two young men joined this movement, each representing a different way in which China could move forward into the 20th century. One of them was Chiang Kai-shek, a man from the cities, able, ruthless, well-favored. Chiang was a graduate of China's leading military academy. He studied military affairs also in Tokyo and Moscow, but he would always look to the West. The other was Mao Tse-tung, an unknown from the country, self-willed and pragmatic. Mao was one of 12 men who founded China's Communist Party in July 1921. He considered himself a Marxist and held a variety of posts within the Chinese Communist movement. But the history of China's revolution was confused by the backing given by Stalin to Chiang Kai-shek. In the 1920s, under orders from Moscow, the communists collaborated with the nationalists in the struggle to turn China into a modern state. Both drew their support mostly from the cities. Mao concerned himself more with the peasants, starting with those of his own province of Hunan. When Chiang Kai-shek turned on the communists in the cities and killed them by the thousands, Mao was in the countryside, forming the nucleus of a peasant army which would eventually carry him to supreme power. For a century, China had been virtually defenseless against foreign powers. The world powers sought prize pickings only from China's misfortunes. The most rapacious of them was Japan. As China drifted further into chaos, the Japanese army became increasingly aggressive on the mainland of China. The Western powers tried to protect their interests with their own troops, but before the outbreak of the Second World War, they made no commitment to come to China's assistance. As the danger of war loomed in Europe, China was left wide open to the depredations of the Japanese. Chiang succeeded in maintaining control over his own forces, but Mao and his fellow communists were on the point of collapse.
Mao was deep in the countryside in Jiangxi province, having beaten off a number of efforts by Chiang Kai-shek to liquidate this very large and growing area of communist settlement. And he had practically no contact with any kind of international events. He realized that he couldn't really fight with his light arms against this kind of heavy artillery and planes, and so he organized a breakout, and that's what became the Long March.
The Long March has become the most legendary event in Mao's rise to power. We can imagine what it was like from newsreel pictures of other Chinese fugitives. Later, the communist regime made their own film version of the Long March. It was, on any showing, a remarkable movement. Mao began with a column of 100,000 supporters. 85,000 of them were soldiers who had gathered round him in the country. Hardly a third of those who started made it to the end. They covered 6,000 miles in all, and they took a year to do it. Their final destination was Yunnan in northwest China, which Mao made his headquarters, while the storms of the Second World War swirled round China. Secure in the hills of Yunnan with the survivors of his peasant army, Mao was at last able to put his ideas into practice. Yunnan remained Mao's home for the next 10 years.
He was doing what he knew how to do, and what he did very well. He was organizing and developing the peasants, and he went on from that to create a growing peasant movement which was communist in name, but really was much more agrarian, and year by year the mass of peasants under his regime grew and grew and grew. It was like having a laboratory experiment.
Yunnan became a showplace for the Maoist-style revolution. Mao's soldiers continued their training for the ultimate trial of strength with Shang. Instead of pillaging and humiliating the peasants, as all other armies had done, Mao's troops became model instructors, helping with education, medical attention, and inevitably political indoctrination. Here, for the first time, Mao began to emerge from the shadows. Mao was determined to be the leader of a new China. One of his weapons was the power of propaganda. Foreign reporters were supplied with new information about the hitherto unknown leader. Almost the only source of material about Mao's early life has come from interviews he gave at Yunnan. Similarly, the only film shots. While the survivors of Mao's Long March recovered their strength, the burden of supporting the struggle against Japan fell on Chiang Kai-shek's followers. With Britain fighting for her life against Hitler's Germany and America not yet in the war, the nationalists were on their own. Chiang could do little but retreat into the interior of China, where he made Chongqing his seat of government. A British ambassador installed himself at Chongqing and carried on in traditional style. Chongqing was not immune to Japanese attack from the air, but after Pearl Harbor, it soon became apparent that Japan's fate would be settled elsewhere than in China. China's fate could only be settled by her own people. Their sufferings before the war had been terrible enough. Great commercial centers like Shanghai and Canton had been devastated by Japanese air and naval bombardments. The task of rebuilding China's commercial life would take a giant effort. America's entry into the war, however, gave Chongqing new importance. President Roosevelt sent his representatives to deal with Chiang as though he were the head of a great power. In 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill invited Chiang to join them in drawing up a declaration of Allied war objectives in the Far East. Probably no one was more surprised than Chiang himself at the dignity that was being conferred upon him. At the same time, the Americans established a military mission with Mao in his hideaway at Yunnan. Under American auspices, Mao flew to Chongqing to meet Chiang and remained there 2 months. This was the only time in his life when photographers not under his control were able to get a close look at Mao, and it enabled Mao also to study the Americans at close quarters. The meeting between Sheng and Mao was a strange interlude in the struggle for power. Each man hoped to see the other dead, but they agreed to put their differences into the background until America had destroyed Japan. American bombers needed Chinese bases to fly over Japan, but in view of Stalin's marked preference for Chiang Kai-shek, Mao had good reason to look for American aid to help rebuild China's shattered economy. With the defeat of Japan, the Americans persuaded both the nationalists and the communists to sign a formal truce, but it was not long before they were at each other's throats again.
With the aid of the mass population, he began to defeat the nationalists in one pitched battle after another, and soon was moving south and captured Peking.
In the cities of the South, Sheng's troops rounded up men suspected of being communists and executed them in the street. Gruesome scenes which had their counterpart in areas overrun by Mao's men. As Mao moved toward Shanghai, gathering support from China's vast army of peasants, panic spread to foreigners. Rumors of communist atrocities brought crowds of refugees to the quayside to board the last ships out. Out of that long struggle across a huge country, Mao had emerged the victor. He was still largely unknown to the outside world, and even within China, he was something of an enigma.
Mao has won. For the first time in 100 years, more than 100 years, all China is unified under one political administration, the communist administration of Mao Tse-tung. He has 600 million people who recognize him as their leaders. But the country as a whole is devastated. Everywhere he looks, there are problems, political, social, and economic.
On October 1st, 1949, a new People's Republic of China was proclaimed. Mao Tse-tung had won power by force of arms, proving the truth of his own dictum that power flows from the barrel of the gun. A grim truth for the rest of the world to live with, but one that at least came unencumbered with Marxist dogma. Mao's regime was almost at once recognized by most of the other major powers, with the notable exception of the United States. The Red Star now flew over the country with the largest population in the world, and China experts held their breath as they waited to see what Mao would do next. Meanwhile, Mao's old antagonist, Chiang Kai-shek, had retreated to the island of Taiwan with the remnants of his army. Backed by the United States, Chiang maintained that his was the only legitimate government of China. It was Chiang's regime which held the permanent seat of the United Nations Security Council, reserved for China by the Allies in the Second World War. The nationalist presence across the China Sea was a constant threat to Mao's totalitarian claims. Whatever else they might be, the nationalists were certainly Chinese, with myriad ties binding them to their homeland. Mao's victory in October 1949 was grudgingly welcomed by the Soviet Union. Ambassadors between the two communist giants were at once exchanged. In driving Sheng out of the mainland of China, Mao had burned his boats as far as obtaining American aid was concerned. Whether he liked it or not, he had to turn for assistance to the Russians, the big nose men, as Chinese called them.
Chinese think in such long terms, and they think of the end not as we do, in the sense that we have to have the results within 48 hours. That didn't bother him. And when he looked at the Soviet Union or looked at Russia, he didn't look at Stalin alone in this particular moment when Stalin was running Russia. He looked back 300 years to see what the record was. And it was all black as far as China was concerned, because the Russians had always been biting off hooks of China. So he didn't really trust them very much.
3 months after assuming power, Mao came in person to Moscow to settle matters with Stalin. Top Soviet officials were on parade to greet him, but their master Stalin kept to the background. He neither trusted Mao nor wanted to deal with him, Mao later told his comrades.
今后的良好结果，深受友好互助万岁。
Mao was to spend nearly 2 months in the Soviet capital. The end result was a treaty of friendship and alliance in which China had to make enormous concessions, not unlike the deals the old imperial China was forced to make with European powers.
There was no man of power with whom Mao quarreled more intensely and over a longer period of time than Stalin. He was in ideological dispute with him because he had a different idea of what China should do in the revolution. And Stalin again and again during Mao's rise attempted to block that rise. As he told his associates later, Stalin didn't trust him and didn't think he could stay in power. Truth of the matter was that Stalin was probably plotting at that very moment to get him out of power.
Mao had no sooner returned from Moscow when war erupted in Korea. It's most probable that Stalin launched it deliberately in order to obtain Russian domination in Korea and so give him a stranglehold over Peking. Mao sought no conflict with America so soon after coming to power, but China was quickly drawn into war. This was to sow intense hostility between Communist China and the United States for the next 20 years. China's growing military power made her a dangerous neighbor to Russia, especially after she had exploded her first atomic device, and so became the world's 5th nuclear power. After Stalin's death, Khrushchev attempted to improve relations between the Soviet Union and China with an enormous aid program. But he and Mao quarreled about how communist power should be used in the world. The aid program foundered, and relations between Russia and China worsened. The smiles hid fears and hates on both sides.
I think that the way Mao did it was to utilize himself as a symbol, the Mao image, the pictures everywhere, the little red book, the badges everyone wore, the quotations, everyone began his sentence with Mao. And Mao was realistic enough and sophisticated enough to be a little embarrassed by this. But he said that, in essence, that with an illiterate people, you had to have this living symbol. Things had to be made very simple. They had to see the leader incarnate, and he was willing to give his image for that purpose. We don't really know very much about his crimes. We don't know very much about the people who have lost their lives in China. As Chinese will tell you again and again, Mao taught us not to kill unnecessarily, perhaps because of the Chinese philosophy in which he was so steeped and of which he was such a product, didn't exercise cruelty for the sake of cruelty. He didn't mind using it if it was necessary, but he was not a man who got his kicks that way. He was a man who saw life as being very cruel. He expected, as the Chinese do, that many lives would be lost in any important endeavor. So it had always been in China, and so he expected it would be, and so his own Chinese peasants felt. They felt the same way. But when he could save their lives, as he did through modernizing their life, they responded very, very positively. I don't think he was so interested in saving lives because of humanitarianism as in making China strong. He felt that China could not endure if it continued to be subject to the plagues that had overcome it in the past.
The organization of the peasants was controlled by Mao's army. Instead of browbeating the peasants, as warlords in the past had done, Mao's soldiers took the lead in helping them. What the camera shows is the regimentation of a whole people whose wills were no longer their own. No one could escape from that regimentation, not even the youngest. That power flows from the barrel of a gun was a truth for children to learn in Mao's order of things.
He was a great man for examples, and I think that perhaps he was sharpened in that by his training as a schoolmaster at the Changsha Normal School. because when he did come to power, he was forever using parables and illustrations and simple, almost black and white stories, which would carry a meaning to the peasants.
Mao brought no master plan to the task of building up his country. His principal contribution was to try out experiments, which produced conflicts with some of his associates who had the day-to-day job of running China. Mao first encouraged criticism of his regime, but when the criticism grew sharp, he had the most vocal critics suppressed. His next experiment was the Great Leap Forward, a movement for Chinese self-sufficiency. The whole of China was invited to set up small model industries, of a kind ridiculed by outsiders and by some of Mao's colleagues as backyard steel mills. The attempt was a disaster and set back production more than it furthered it. These costly failures reduced Mao's standing among his colleagues. He appeared to be dropping into the background and assuming the role of an elder statesman, while direction of affairs passed into the hands of younger men. But then in 1965, Mao emerged from this apparent retirement to launch what became known as the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution.
Mao probably understood power better than almost any contemporary statesman. He understood it in realistic terms. He fought to get it. When he lost it, he knew he had lost it. And then he fought to get it back again. Power for him was on a scale that is almost inconceivable for any Westerner to understand, because power to him meant the leadership and the movement of an enormous tide of people.
The day after his famous swim in the river, Mao came to Peking and took over the Cultural Revolution. What followed were 4 years of turbulence, anarchy, and occasional civil war in China's cities, factories, and universities. For years, the nation was in such turmoil that production in factories dropped to alarmingly low levels. Only the peasant masses in the army were relatively immune from the struggle. Mao's objectives in promoting this upheaval were not clear, except that certain individuals in the government were driven from office.
He simply couldn't live with him in the last period of his life. Profoundly disagreed with him, and also wanted the power back in his own hands. He'd lost a large hunk of it, and he wanted it back. And he got it back only to see the whole thing. Well, I guess he didn't realize it because he was gaga before he died, but the whole damn thing just really blew up in his own hands after he got it. It was too late. He should have stayed the elder statesman as they wanted him to be. He should have stayed on that shelf. But he wouldn't do it. He came back down for one great last whirl of Luan, that marvelous anarchy and confusion out of which he believed the perfect order was going to emerge. And it was the Luan that really did him in.
Thousands, it is thought, were killed in the Cultural Revolution. According to Mao's doctrine, a greater order should have emerged from the chaos. But to what purpose? Was it only to glorify Mao himself?
Mao summed up his philosophy typically for a Chinese in a poem. 10,000 years are too long. Seize the day, seize the hour. The four seas boil, clouds and waters rage.
Mao used his power to extend China's influence towards her traditional frontiers. Tibet was invaded. Indochina infiltrated with communist-inspired guerrillas. Hanoi became a client state, and pressure was extended towards Saigon. The Americans responded with a disastrous war in Vietnam. At first, Mao feared that the Americans would attack China. But as this danger receded, it seemed that his policy would more likely lead to a clash with Russia. Mao's youthful dream had been to restore China to her ancient power and dignity. When the President of the United States came in person to Peking, it must have seemed to the aging Mao as though he had achieved the summit of power. When Mao died in September 1976, China experts once again held their breath. Would the power system he had forged die with him?
Mao is dead. His widow and his closest associates, now called the Gang of Four, are in prison. Many aspects of his philosophy are gradually being downplayed, but Mao's spirit will hover over China for centuries to come. This man has changed China, and his successors are not going to change it back and going to carry on with a modified form of his philosophy and rule in his name for as long as the regime endures.